In 2002, the creation of a key leadership role transformed how agencies manage what many say is the federal government's most critical asset, its people. The Chief Human Capital Officers Act established both the CHCO role and the CHCO Council to ensure effective management of the government-wide workforce. But challenges in human capital still persist. Here with more, Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
So we're doing a little history lesson here. Where did the need for the CHCO position come from?
If you look back to the late 90s, early 2000s, there were a lot of different conversations that were converging about the need for more human capital management and a better management process for the federal workforce. So the Office of Personnel Management was talking about this. The Government Accountability Office was looking into this more. And then President George W. Bush at the time, the first pillar of his president's management agenda talked about the strategic management of human capital. So this was coming into the conversation a lot more at the time. And then in Congress, too, you had Senator George Voinovich calling for better human capital management in the federal government. So despite all these conversations going on and this kind of push for a stronger management of that concept and of the workforce, nothing really happened until 2002, and that was more of a response to the terrorist attacks that happened on 9/11. The CHCO Act was included as part of the Homeland Security Act at the time, so even though there were a lot of these conversations going on, it kind of took something a little bit stronger, a national security crisis really, to actually make this legislation a reality. And I spoke with John Salamone, who is a longtime federal human capital leader, one of the early directors of the CHCO Council, and he talked about how that legislation changed the role of human capital in government.
HR had always been a really important function in the government, but when you compared it to the chief financial officers, the CIOs, even the chief acquisition officers, they didn't have a complete seat at the table. And in order to, round out that C-suite function, the real push was to promote this notion of elevating human resources, getting them at the seat of the table with other C-suite functions so they could be on an even playing field, involved in conversations about the workforce.
It's really hard to remember a time when there weren't federal CHCOs, but what's the role of the CHCO today? What's the job like?
So that's something that really changed with the passage of the CHCO Act. Before that, you had HR directors, you had people who were managing the workforce, but nothing that was really standardized across government. So the 2002 legislation, in that, Congress called for a CHCO role that was specifically responsible for selecting, developing, training, and then managing the federal workforce, and one that would be high quality, one that would be productive, and be able to deliver on agency missions. On top of that, it also created the CHCO Council, but in the role of the CHCO itself, the idea was having someone there who understood human capital really deeply, especially with considering the need for having a good understanding of federal regulations, being able to assess the current workforce characteristics as well as future needs. So there's a lot of very complicated factors that go into the CHCO role, and one that is very hard for people to accomplish. I spoke with Tracy DiMartini, who is a longtime human capital officer. She's been with many different federal agencies, and she explained how deep that position really goes.
Everyone thinks it's just transactional business, meaning processing personnel actions or handling payroll and benefits. But it's also making sure you're training the next generation of managers and leaders and taking one step back, actually selecting the ones that can be successful. It's making sure you're providing a world-class experience for your employees. It's about relationship building. One of the best things I think about being a CHCO is learning how to navigate relationships with people above you, people on your level, and maybe people that you are leading. It's also building external relationships with Congress and the labor unions.
It really is a complicated position in a world where the regulations and the rules are really complicated themselves. The Act also added a CHCO Council, which is a new feature. What was the vision for that?
So the idea there was to have these CHCOs, these new leaders of HR and government, be able to strategize, develop policies across government, share ideas, share lessons learned on how they're trying to attack some of these really long-standing challenges in managing the federal workforce. So, for example, time to hire or dealing with all the different hiring authorities. That's something that CHCOs have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Maybe there's pockets of success where CHCOs have done things well. Maybe that's something that can be shared with other agencies. So the idea there was to really just make this group where you can sound different ideas off of one another. Over time, the shape of the CHCO Council has changed. Usually there's different subcommittees that focus on specific problems. There was also the creation of a deputy CHCO Council after a couple of years with just the CHCO Council. Even though the legislation kind of set the groundwork, it's really something that's changed over time as well.
So as people are looking at the history of the CHCO and CHCO Council, have there been trends and challenges that they've faced over time? What are the biggest issues that either they've dealt with or been unable to deal with?
One that comes up time and again, and that I already mentioned, is time to hire, or just the recruitment process for federal employees. That's something where agencies have struggled a long time. That you hear the same kinds of conversations. I mean, when I was looking back and listening to George Voinovich talk about some of this stuff back in 2002, some of those same challenges are still persistent today in human capital and just being able to address recruitment and retention challenges in government. There was also just one moment in history during the first Trump administration when there was the failed merger of OPM with the General Services Administration. At the time, OPM lost control over the CHCO Council during the first Trump term. Eventually, it came back during the Biden administration, but that also set the groundwork for just reshaping the council and just trying to change a little bit of how they're approaching a lot of these human capital challenges too.
Well, the world of HR keeps changing and keeps getting more complicated as we hear about AI and screening and just the complexity of the whole application process. What is the future for the CHCOs and the CHCO Council?
I think, right now there is some uncertainty in what the role of the CHCO is going to look like moving forward. As you can imagine, with all of the really rapid, really big changes that have been happening in the federal workforce, the CHCO Council has actually been very, very active in the last couple of months in trying to, address some of these challenges and just trying to stand up some of the expectations and the policies of the Trump administration. Colleen Heller-Stein, who's the current executive director of the CHCO Council, when I spoke with her, she talked about standing up the deferred resignation program as an example of how the CHCO Council is working right now.
How do we get to a place where we can offer this to the maximum number of employees, but also allow employees to offboard in the way that suited them, while also continuing to meet agency mission needs and that sort of thing. And again, not a small ask at all, but in a fairly short amount of time, I think that, bringing that group together, partnering with OPM, we were able to pretty swiftly implement something that was new and novel pretty successfully.
Well, it sounds like the vision that was enacted back in 2002 has been pretty resilient and responsive in the face of lots and lots of changes.
That's definitely one way to put it. Others have definitely critiqued the way that the Trump administration is handling human capital and the federal workforce. So I think there are definitely conflicting responses to the way that the federal workforce has changed recently. But I think at the end of the day, CHCOs are going to be pretty central regardless of what direction the administration is going to take. They are central to being able to implement those policies and being able to give directions on what is going to make sense and how to kind of execute on a lot of the changes that, regardless of what an administration is, a lot of the changes that they're trying to make. So it's something that where they kind of transcend, regardless of where the workforce is, they kind of transcend each administration in that way.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Thanks for joining me today, Drew.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find Drew's story and more of our 25th anniversary content on federalnewsnetwork.com.